And now for something completely different.
Let me begin with a prediction. There will be another recession sometime in the future. Now I know what you're thinking. Whoa there, Captain Obvious. Enough with the crazy prognostications. Everyone knows that as sure as night follows day, economic recessions follow expansions. But unfortunately, history tells us that the longer the expansion goes on, the more complacent people tend to be. This is a chart of US economic recessions from 1854 onwards. This data is courtesy of the National Bureau of Economic Research, the body that officially dates US business cycles. What's important to note in this chart is about halfway through, after the Second World War, you'll notice that economic expansions are longer in duration and recessions are less frequent and of shorter duration. And that's because the post-World War II economy was quite different than the pre-war economy, for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to go over here because they're not relevant to this discussion. But the reason I bring it up is because I'm going to make statements about the current economic cycle in comparison to history, but I'm going to confine that historical context to post-war economic cycles only. This chart illustrates further what I mean. As you can see, economic expansions in the latter half of the 19th century and early 20th centuries had a much shorter duration. On average, they lasted about 27 months, less than half the post-war average of 58 months. Looking at post-war expansions, we see that the current expansion is the fourth longest on record, the longest being the 10 years from the trough in March 91 to the peak in March 2001. So my basic thesis is this. There's a very high probability, given the length of economic cycles, that the next US recession will happen during the next presidential term. If it doesn't, that would make it the longest expansion in US history, which of course is a possibility, but history tells us is unlikely. Now there is always a "this time is different" argument, and today it would be that extraordinary interventions by central banks, like zero interest rates, like quantitative easing and asset purchases, have prolonged the current expansion, and that central banks stand ready to do more in the event of new economic strains. Even though there's no evidence that what they've done to date has been of any economic benefit except to delay the inevitable. So whilst the argument that central banks have prolonged the current cycle has some merit, we should be skeptical of the idea that they've somehow forever vanquished recessions from history. So why the attention on economic cycles? For a couple of reasons. One is political, the other financial. In this video, I'm going to concentrate on the political and then follow it up with a video about the stock market. So as the US counts down to election day, now less than 8 weeks away, there is, as there always is, talk about this election being the most important election of our lives, of our generation, since you get the idea. But this is nothing new, as this article from Counterpunch notes. In 1888, during a campaign in which Benjamin Harrison and Grover Cleveland feuded over industrial tariffs, the New York Times proclaimed that the Republic is approaching what is to be one of the most important elections in its history. More recently, Senator Robert Byrd announced that the 1992 election may be the most important election of this century, while Bill Clinton more modestly claimed that it was merely the most important election in a generation. Barbra Streisand even announced that the 1998 midterm election was one of the most important elections in the history of this country, before realizing that it was in fact the 2004 election that was the most important election of our lifetime. Al Franken agreed with Barbara, Pearl Jam, and Bruce Springsteen, among others, that the Bush-Kerry election was the most important in memory, while Obama asserted that it was the 2008 election that was the most important in our lifetime. During the most recent election, Nancy Pelosi proclaimed that the Obama-Romney face-off was the most important of our generation, while Newt Gingrich declared that the 2012 contest was the most important since the Civil War. So don't get sucked in by the hype. This will not be the election to end all elections. there will be another and another, and the world will keep spinning regardless of who wins. But the point of the economic cycle in all this is to say that there's a good chance that whoever wins in November will preside over the next recession. And inevitably, they will have to own it, regardless of who or what caused it. No one could blame Obama for the Great Recession, but he did have to take responsibility for getting the economy growing again. Fortunately for him, the recession bottomed early into his presidency, and so he had a couple of years to get the economy back on track before the next election cycle. Not that the Obama administration did a particularly stellar job. The unemployment rate continued to climb after his inauguration. Again, not his fault, but his administration had optimistically predicted they would get it under control much sooner and that it would be less severe than it actually was. In fact, by election day 2012, the unemployment rate had only just returned to the same place it had been when Obama entered office. Similarly, George W. Bush couldn't be blamed for the recession associated with the dot-com bust, but fortunately for Bush, the recession that started just a couple of months after his inauguration was relatively short and shallow. The unemployment rate never rose above 6.5%, and then of course the country was distracted from the economy by 9/11 and the subsequent war in Iraq. Not so lucky was George Herbert Bush. First President Bush was sworn in January 1989, and he inherited an unemployment rate of just under 5.5%, a rate that hadn't been seen since Nixon in 1973. Of course, that was in large part due to the boom of the 80s under the Reagan administration, of which Bush was a part. But just over 18 months later, the US economy fell into recession after an almost 8-year expansion. The recession was short-lived and relatively shallow, ending in March 1991, just as the US launched the ground invasion into Iraq, and President Bush's approval rating hit 90%. However, the unemployment rate continued to rise for more than a year, peaking at 7.8% in June 1992, just a few months before the election, and Bush had by that time a disapproval rating of 64%. Subsequently, the Clinton campaign seized on this with the slogan, "It's the economy, stupid," to great effect to oust Bush. So what's the point of this trip down memory lane? Well, just to recap, the next president will likely preside over the next recession during the next presidential term. If that happens, it's better for that president if the recession happens early so that the economy has time to recover before the next election cycle, as it did with Obama and Bush II, even though both administrations were widely criticized for the slow pace of the recovery in both instances. Although the economy was on the upswing into the great 90s boom by election day in November 1992, Bush lost the election at least in part due to the perception of poor economic management. So if you're a Trump supporter, at least in part because you believe Trump is strong on the economy and jobs, just keep in mind that if a recession happens under a Trump first term, no amount of rhetoric from Trump is going to stop the inevitable loss of jobs and the unemployment rate from rising. And regardless of where the blame lies, Trump will be seen as a failure on a key part of his platform. But regardless of the outcome, given the unpopularity of both these candidates, could either one of them survive a recession in their first term? Is it worth considering that a better alternative for Republicans and conservatives alike would be to regroup and shoot for 2020, in part because Hillary has a good chance of becoming the first one-term president in nearly 30 years? Obviously, this is all very hypothetical. There are many other ways this could play out, and I'm not suggesting that I have the answers. I'm just floating the idea that instead of the short-term focus on this election, perhaps a better alternative would be to focus on the long game further down the road.